Well, here we are in our little piece of England that we all love so much, sort of wedged between the sea and two great growing cities. We're here to celebrate what makes the forest special, exploring what we know. Knowledge is great because it should actually inform what we do next. The forest is always changing, and the change does need to be informed. What I'm going to cover in the next 20 minutes or so all relates to the commons of the open forest. There's more to the New Forest National Park and the New Forest General Area than this, but this is what I'm going to be focusing on. It's going to be a celebration, have a little caveat in the middle, and then celebrating again. Now, I think this goes red when I press the button. It does. The headline is that the New Forest is the largest and most complete of the heathlands, or of Britain's southern heathland landscapes. I'm currently spending a lot of time travelling the length and breadth of Britain looking at heathlands for a future work, and there is nowhere quite like the forest for its completeness. And by completeness, I mean it's more than just a carpet of purple for the tourists. It's more than just heather. By the way, whenever I look at my slides, I review them, they virtually always have cars in the background, which possibly says something about the forest as it is today. So we have the largest and most complete heathland landscape of all its component habitats in the country. And those components other than heather, here we have just a little bit of one of the forest's ancient and ornamental woodlands, old growth woodlands. They grow at their own pace, they regenerate at their own pace. They are structured by large herbivores. There have been academics in the past who have likened our woodlands as to how the British landscape would have been in the Holocene, that is, after the last major glacial period. Trouble with being an ecologist is you think short-term, long-term. I'm going to talk about having a long view later, and it's different from a long view of maybe other people here. They are near natural, but as we'll hear from other speakers, that naturalness has been tempered by people over the millennia. Of course, when the last glaciation ended, lots of mammals moved north into these warmer climes, including ourselves. We are part of the native fauna of this part of the world. We shouldn't separate ourselves from it. So we've seen some lovely woodlands, smashing bogs. It's been brilliant this year. I was talking to a very grumpy commoner friend of mine who was saying, I like bogs. Bogs are great. The cattle were in the bogs all summer, munching away at the millennia where the rest of the forest had dried out. We have the majority of northwest Europe's valley bogs in the forest. They're important for the biology they support, but also the history they contain. You've got 8,000 to 10,000 years of detritus tangled up in the peat, in the deep deposits here. They tell us our history way beyond documentation. In the modern age, when we're all worried about carbon and climate change, they fix an awful lot of carbon and hold it there over geological timescales. They're not alone in doing that. Old growth woodlands are good, heathlands are good, but they are great carbon fixers. In recent years, we've suddenly realised that our rivers are rather good, and that knowledge of it being rather good didn't really come from homegrown understanding. It's when continentals started to come over, and I can remember walking this is the river near Ashurst, with some Dutch people. And they said, good gracious, it has not been normalised, which is a lovely use of English. We have river systems which rise on the heathlands and flow for the vast majority of their course through natural catchments, natural habitats to the sea. Places like the Crockford Bridge, but also the Lymington and the Beaulieu rivers. They are remarkable. And they go right down to the foreshore. They are beginning to teach us what excellence in water bodies looks like. It's so difficult when you're visiting places that have been damaged to know what you might aspire to. And the forest is helping teach people, Northwest Europe locally, what we might aspire to. And that's rather an old slide, but just to remind us that the open forest includes the foreshore. We go all the way down to the intertidal, very narrow little pieces of connectivity that take us to the foreshore, but forest ponies can graze right up to the Lymington ferries, should they wish. It's a bit of a muddy old place. But I'll touch on the impacts they have ecologically a little later. Talked about the freshwater and saltwater systems. Picture of some ponds that my wife and I have been monitoring. That's obviously a pond, but this is another pond right bang next to each other. There's about 3 metres that separate these ponds. The one in the foreground, the green one, that's, well, let's use a posh name. It's an oligotrophic ephemeral pond. In other words, it's only wet for part of the year, and most of the forest's ponds are only wet for part of the year. When it is wet, it's really well oxygenated, and it's absolutely stuffed full of life. The pond in the background is a dystrophic pond. In other words, it is a pond which has got very little oxygen and an awful lot of suspended peat in it. And when you hold a water glass like this up with it, the oligotrophic one looks like gin, and the dystrophic one looks like sherry with lots of flecky bits. I know which one I prefer to drink. Never been one for sherry. But there are hundreds and hundreds of ponds. We have no catalogue of them. People like Naomi Ewald and others are beginning to try to track them. But the pond people tell us anything that's at least 1 metre across that holds water for at least 4 months of the year is a pond. Now, if anyone goes for a walk on the forest in February, you'll be thinking, is it a pond or isn't it? It is stunning. You know, we are learning so much about, again, quality, what quality looks like from our forest ponds. It gets a bit boring because every time you do a water chemistry test, you're thinking, oh, absolutely clean. Absolutely clean every time. Very dull. One of my favourite habitats of the forest are the lanes and the village greens and the bits next to the villages which stitch all the grazed commons together. Sometimes they're drove roads, sometimes they're ancient lanes. These were just commonplace throughout the lowlands of Britain until fairly recently, the end of the 18th century is when they began to shrink, where livestock would just wander to and from the farms. They come out the farm gate, they would wander onto the common. They are survivors of an ancient landscape. They remind us as to habitats that we used to have. They are stuffed to the gunnels with species that used to be common through Britain and are now rare. Their populations have collapsed. Some of them to a point where they're critically endangered, some of them to a point where they're functionally extinct. I'll touch a little bit more on that later with a few examples. And I'm really going to stick my head into the noose. The bracken habitats on the forest are stunningly nice. They're just stuffed to the gunnels with good things, where they're cared for well. We do have to remember bracken is a natural fern, it's our most common fern. We tend to demonise it. Now, heather is good, bracken is bad. When you actually look at the ecology and what depends on them and their associates, there's not that much difference to them. They're superbly rich, when we're well cared for, and of course they have a deep history of being one of the most important crops from the forest, from the people who have used the forest. I've talked in big terms there, haven't I? Big habitats, and they are all absolutely at the peak of quality in terms of British heathland landscapes. Let's move on to just one or two species. I don't know how many people actually get to see gladioli. If you go for a wander first of all, if you go for a wander in early spring and you see where the bluebells are, that gives you a pretty good clue as to where the gladioli might be later. But you need to get well into the cricket season before you're hunting down gladioli. A species of rich, quite productive soils, almost certainly with some history of woodland cover before they became bracken on the heath, with a very wide range of species, including our gladioli. Things like gladioli have always been rare, or let's say of a very restricted distribution in Britain. course, it was first discovered on the Isle of Wight, where it survived till the 1930s. It was also known in Dorset. Its abundance in the forest only really became understood in the latter part of the 20th century. But these things which have always been rare, and the forest is known for its rarities, but they've always been rare, are very unusual. Because if you take a long view, no, not a long view, a medium-term view, back to just pre-industrial age, 1700s, 1750s, there was nothing really very special about the forest. The landscapes we have here, the social, the economic structures we have here were commonplace. We have become special because we have survived. Now, if all of you who are Shakespeare scholars know your Malvolio. Some are born rare, some achieve rareness, and some have rareness thrust upon them. And that is the history of the forest. But because we've survived, we do have strong populations of species whose populations have crashed elsewhere. This is the lesser butterfly orchid. If you look at a distribution map of this, when botanists were first working, it was all over lowland England in good commons. It's just gone. It's gone from so many places. And it's gone from so many places because the life of the commons, the life of the heath has changed. I shall go into that a bit more. I touched on the greens, that lovely picture of the pig. I'm giving a talk at a forest wetland meeting later this year, where I'm going to talk about one of my favourite little scruffy urchins of a plant, something called small fleabane. It looks like a slightly mildewed daisy with all the white petals torn off. Was very widespread across the Welsh borders and the south of England, right up to about the First World War, and it has crashed. And the reason it's crashed, village greens are village greens in name alone in most of our country now. They're just a sort of a nice green felt baize for you to drive your Porsche across. But anyway, you've had an orchid, you've had your gladioli. The forest is stuffed full of most of the rarities, most of the things that make it special are small and squiggly. Here's some nice cladonias. If you had Neil Sanderson here, he could rattle off endless things of international importance. Increasingly understanding it's where our heaths are burnt and then immediately grazed, or are close grazed, so the heather is this permanently low mat, which is impossible to burn, because there's not enough to burn there, but it's got bare ground in between. And lots of rarities seem to like these quirks in management that makes the forest special. Time for cheerfulness is about to end, but we'll finish it on a... Sorry about the words. I don't like using words on PowerPoint. You can speed read, just pick a number and pick a word. These data come from Paul Brock's excellent book. The forest, there are very few things that do particularly well here. The populations aren't very high, because in ecological diversity, lots of things survive, but few thrive. So you get great diversity, but you often get very low biomass. So we have an enormous diversity of insects, large proportion of the British species. I was surprised how low a proportion we have of dung flies, but I'm told that the uplands have their own special dung things. But we're all worried about bumblebees now. They are bumblebees, 80%. Of the species of British bumblebees are known here. We celebrated it. It's a bit like being at school where you're taught to love something and then you're told to be guilty about it. A few years ago, before my lifetime, but anyway, decades ago, we could have put 80% of Britain's butterflies were known from the forest. No longer. We have had crashes in both species diversity and in abundance. But the current population crashes in breeding things are ground nesting birds. I've been doing some work with Hampshire Ornithological Society recently, looking at changes of ground nesting birds in the forest. It is so difficult to scientifically prove the causality of why has something collapsed, and one has to be very cautious. But at the same time, you can look at trends and you could learn from experience elsewhere. At the height of our paper protection, between about 2000 and 2010, when law and policy was just peachy for the forest, it was wonderful. In those 10 years, we lost shelduck as a breeding species, we lost windchat, we lost wheatears, we lost little ring plovers, we lost ring plovers. Now, that's recent ages. It's not like saying in the 1950s there were 20-odd pairs of Montague Harriers, or in the 1920s we had black grouse here. They are more into the past. But these are species that here and now have failed. They're all ground nesters. There's another suite of species which are failing fast, and that's the wading birds. Since the 1980s, breeding populations of redshank, snipe and lapwing have all declined by at least 90%, 90%. They're heading for extinction. We're learning more about other species. Curlew, there's some very good work being done, and woodcock, there's some work being done, which might help us understand that more. They say I'm not here to say we can prove why this is so. There are national trends, there are regional trends. These aren't easy to understand. But we know the four driving forces of extinctions of ground nesting birds are habitat fragmentation, loss of quality of habitat, disturbance, and artificially enhanced predation. And those four things have been recognised for decades now. If you go to managed nature reserves, which are very carefully managed to address these issues, you're not getting the losses you're getting on the forest. In my notes, I wrote the word embarrassment. We should be embarrassed about this. I'm thinking, no, we should be ashamed of it. Here we have a landscape owned and managed by the state with the highest level of protection, yet we are hemorrhaging species. Right, I'm going to get back to something more cheerful because as a conservationist, you need to. So why are we so good? This is Len Mansbridge's herd, by the way, down Ashurst Lodge. Doing a brilliant job with lots of rarities. They just love this level of livestock in one place at one time. It's all about the naturalness of a landscape with large herbivores. If you like, the ecology of pastoralism, that rather pompous title I had for my talk. Things like cows, things like pigs, have been with our landscape for a very, very long time. If you want to take a really proper long view, you go back to the Oligocene, which is about 30 million years ago, where there was an evolution of large herbivores and herbaceous vegetation, grassy vegetation, and the emergence of species and the incredibly complex ecology of those species began to form. If any of you ever go out and watch a forest butterfly, silver-studded blue, something like that, and you actually start to track back its life cycle and the habitat structures it needs and its relationships with ants and its relationships with burning, relationships with large animals, they are hugely complex. These things don't happen overnight. They take millions of years to evolve. And in the last couple of million years, we're getting really quite up to date now, as you're approaching the great waves of ice that are washed up and down our part of Europe, those species were there from the fossil record. Most of the species we know today were there, and with climate change they moved up and down the continent in relation to the ice. And what large beasts like this do, in a way that invertebrates can't, much of the herbivory on the forest is invertebrates eating the plants, is they move nutrients around the landscape. They eat something, it goes into their body, some of it is fixed in their body, and if they die on site, of course, it then gets recycled. But they move nutrients around and they add to structural diversity. You get immensely complex structures, including lots and lots of bare ground. And bare ground is a habitat, nutrient-poor bare ground that is probably the rarest and most threatened in Britain today. But they provide it in spades. And because of the economy of the forest, which is based on pastoralism, livestock economy on a large scale, driven by our survival of commoning, we have these in abundance. There are commoning systems elsewhere in Britain which are based on hay or based on arable. We used to have those in the forest, they have gone. But our commoning systems based on livestock are still there. Commoning could be argued to be the driving force that secured the special qualities of the open forest. I was discussing this with some people recently, and I thought that's rather artificial in separating them out, that economy out from the other things I've shown you that are special. They are one and the same. They are interlinked. You can't tease out one and say it survives without the other. So where does commoning work well? It doesn't always work well. You know, we all know of glitches and problems. I've only known the forest for about 30 years, so my perspective is really from the 80s to the present day. It's where we have a diverse sector, where you have a great many people exercising their rights, but each of them is doing it in a different way. And those ways vary over time. So you're getting peaks and troughs of activity across a whole landscape, across immense periods of time. I've likened this to the cinema. When I was a teenager, I used to go to the cinema, and before the Pearl and Dean adverts, there were those sort of amoeba-like oil blobs that sort of moved over the screen and have a calming influence on you. Very psychedelic, I suppose, when I look back on it now. But anyway, the blobs form, intensify, break up. There's constant change, but you can see barriers, you can identify each thing. And that's how habitats, when they work well on the forest, work well. They shift in time and space, but they are always there. There's continuity, but it's not like preserving a listed building or a castle. It doesn't happen at the same time in the same place over time. There are risks and abuses to manage, so we need regulatory regimes. Modern commoning is just that. It is modern. It's having to compete in a world. I teased on, you know, a place to park your Porsche, but I can recall, I won't be precise about the common, but you might know it, where I had a gentleman with his incredibly expensive cottage, massively expanded, and his Porsche, complaining about the mud of a commoner who did have rather a lot of livestock around his gate, I have to admit. But I thought, oh, this is terrible. You know, I like the address, I like the kudos of living here, I love the landscape, but I don't want the interference of, you know, God, you paid that for a Porsche. You do not expect mud on its wheel guards. They are living in this. There is a real tension. Wealth, if anything is going to displace commoning, it's wealth. Access to homes, access to land, ability to make a living. So it's at risk. I hope today we'll explore that more. I promised I'd finish early, so I'm going to. I think our next talk is Graham Bathe, and I think you're going to give us a broader perspective. Hopefully. Thank you very much for listening. May I introduce Graham?